Right. So I want to welcome you all to today's panel discussion. Just want to say that we closed registration when we were over 100 people who signed up. So people in the back, if you wouldn't mind moving forward a bit, there are people still walking in. We want to start, and we don't want the event to get interrupted. I'm H.V. Jagadish. I'm the director of the Michigan Institute for Data Science. MIDAS, for those of you who don't know about it, is an organization at the University of Michigan that's trying to promote data science and AI efforts around the university. One of the things is to understand consequences of some of the progress that's being made in these fields. So I'm delighted that we have this distinguished panel here today to talk to us about ChatGPT in the classroom. I want to thank our co-sponsors, which is LSNA, and particularly the office of Tim McKay, who's on the panel, and the AI Lab, which the director, Rada Mihalcea, is here as well. I want to thank the people who put this show together today, including Jordan in particular, and also Rachel Smith and Ben Sergalski, who are running around somewhere. And with that, I'd like to call upon Josh Pasek, who's an associate director of MIDAS for the social sciences, associate professor of communications, media, and political science, and faculty associate at the Center for Political Studies at ISR. So thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Jag. So yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you all for coming to this. We thought that it was important to have some conversations about where the university is and how we should all be thinking about AI as it's increasingly coming to not just be a subject of important research here at the university up in iLab and elsewhere, but increasingly coming to affect the way that all of us engage in our day-to-day lives. And from that perspective, it seemed like this might be a good place to start that conversation. So as Jag already mentioned, I'm one of the associate directors for MIDAS, but we felt like having AI researchers formally in the conversation with those who are trying to figure out sort of what its social implications are going to look like and how that's going to play out at the university level is something that we're focusing on. I want to highlight a few things about today. We are recording this, and we will make it available to people who are interested in accessing it afterwards, but we wanted to make it sort of, at least at the time, an in-person thing. And then what I'm going to do throughout this is I'm going to sort of hand things over to our different panelists. I'm going to sort of play just a moderator role here. We're going to spend about 25, 30 minutes of introductions where I'm also going to give each of the panelists a different sort of question that I think they can help us get some insight on their perspective, research-wise and otherwise, about how they're looking at these kinds of technologies. We'll then move into a series of questions that I think are going to be more of a discussion among us, and then we'll move to audience questions. And each of those will be about half an hour in practice. And so that's the plan for today. So I'm going to start it off by handing things over and introducing people. First up is Rada. Mihalcea. Mihalcea. I asked and promptly screwed it up as was perhaps to be expected. And Rada is a professor up in iLab and will talk to us at least a little bit about how these technologies work and what they're doing under the hood. So let me hand it over.
All right. Well, thank you. And it's great to have you all here, interested in what these technologies can do. And also, I'm very curious to hear the kind of questions that people have. And really, I think at this point, we are in need of conversations to understand how these kind of technologies can be used, should not be used. I've been working in natural language processing for about 25 years now. So this is really the field that led also to ChatGPT and other such very large language models that we see today. So natural language processing is an area in AI, and it has to do with really processing languages like English, Romanian, Chinese, Spanish, and all the other 7,000 plus languages. And there has been a lot of progress. Earlier work that was done in the field has been slower in progress, also partly due to how much data we had available, how much computational power we had. But as predicted by others, progress is accelerating. So we've seen that acceleration in recent years. And so there are all these like very large language models that surface, including, I think, the culmination point right now. Who knows what the near future will bring is ChatGPT. How these models work, there isn't really any secret sauce to them. It's really, and there are papers published out there. Obviously, there might be a few things that maybe the companies kept to themselves, but really the main idea is the same that's been out there since a while back, which is the idea of language models, which means that given a series of words, you can predict what word will follow, right? So if I say, a cat sat on the, and then you'll think what will follow, maybe you'll say mat, right? So that will be the next likely word given what you've seen before. Now that's been out there sort of since always, since the beginning of natural language processing, but a few things have changed, and I've already mentioned them, is having more data and having more compute. So really what ChatGPT does is a very large language model, but now instead of training on, say, some books or data that we can compile together, so maybe you get the Michigan Library or some other document, it's really training on the whole internet. So what that means, these are all estimates, is about 400 billion words that these models were trained on with the same simple idea. Given a series of words, can I predict the next one? And then on top of that, you can put some more curated data like Wikipedia. That's also some 3 billion words, but it's cleaner data. You can put some 60 billion words coming maybe from books. Also, very interestingly, these more recent models threw in some code as well. So we have all these GitHub repositories with a lot of open source code. And that's thrown in there as well, not just as yet another data set, but there is more and more research that shows that there is more abstract thinking that is encoded in code. So that also helps with some of those predictions. So that's one thing, a lot of data. Another thing is the models themselves. So it's still the same idea that I mentioned, which is really very simple. But now, because we have all this data, we can go back in time longer. Rather than saying a cat sat on the, like maybe 5 words, maybe I go back 1,000 words. Like say what I said for the past 5 minutes and predict what will I say next. So what is happening with that is that you get this very coherent text, which is very human-like looking, which is what we see in ChatGPT, because you have this longer history and because you can afford to have that longer history due to the amount of training data that we have. Now, the models themselves are also a little bit more sophisticated. So we used to have hidden Markov models. Now a lot of what's being done is based on deep learning, which really deep learning is, again, old technology. So it's neural networks, which have been around since the 50s. But now they work at much bigger scale. And probably you hear a lot about number of parameters. Like these recent models, like GPT and the like, are around 175 billion parameters. What that means, so a neural network is really considered to be similar to how the brain works. So you have neurons which are connected between them. So I have a number of neurons which have some input and produce an output. The output of those neurons will go to other neurons and so forth. So the unit is really very simple. but it's a lot of them. So when you hear 175 billion parameters, really means 175 billion edges, like links between neurons. So it's really the size of the network, which you can train and learn because you have a lot of data and because you have a lot of computational power. And now, probably I should try to wrap it up. On top of that, what are a couple of other things I think are interesting is having also some supervised learning. So there is human demonstration. Like the reason why ChatGPT has been such a big leap forward compared to what we had even like 3 months before ChatGPT is because it threw in human demonstrations. Like people would be asked, how do you write a summary? And they will demonstrate, like, this is how you write a summary. How do you paraphrase something? How do you write, like, give me a list of this and that? So there is this, they call it human demonstrations. It's really just human input on very specific tasks. And there is quite a bit of that as well. So you can read more under Instruct GPT. There are papers around that. And so that's also what's given in. And then it's you and I. So you use ChatGPT and you give it the thumbs up. Yes, this was a good output. Or you give it a thumbs down. And that's feedback, which is, again, thrown in the model to improve over time. And we've seen already iterations over time that are improving. So I'll stop there to give room to others. But that's, there is no secret sauce. It's really the old techniques, but now at large scale.
All right, thank you. And so next is Kentaro Toyama. And Kentaro is in the School of Information. And our question for your introduction as you introduce yourself is, how can we expect students to interact with AI tools in the future?
Right. I mean, I think the immediate fear that many of us have as faculty is students submitting assignments which are written by ChatGPT and other AI tools and pretending that it's their own, right? And you can imagine that's happening with essay assignments, with application essays, with code, with all kinds of things. And over time, I think pretty much anything we might ask of students, there will be some way to generate that with AI. I do think that's a problem, but I think it's identical to the problems we already face, actually. So there are systems like, there are platforms like Course Hero and Chegg where students can look up past problem sets and solution sets, other students' assignments, and so on. And then, of course, right now there's an industry of people who will do other people's assignments for pay. And to me, that's, qualitatively for the faculty member, I don't think it's fundamentally any different. I do think there will be some differences in scale. So technology like ChatGPT make this much easier for students to do, possibly at a much lower cost, and also at much larger scale. So there will be a kind of a scale challenge. A little bit more medium term, I think some of the challenges will be that tools like ChatGPT will become kind of like embedded, tutors that students can use all the time for anything that they're working on. So even a student who's completely, honest in their intention might take a draft of something, ask, a system like ChatGPT to comment on it or improve it or point out things that it could be better. And if you imagine, like in my engagement with my PhD students, I do that, and every once in a while I'll say, I'll just write out the sentence because it's easier for me to say that than to provide, a question kind of a feedback, right? But if you're doing that all the time, there's this fundamental question of, well, how much of this is a student's work versus how much of it is really, ChatGPT or another such tool. So I think the lines blurring there between what a student has actually produced and what is actually more from an AI system, I think will be difficult to understand and figure out. And then going further into the future, I can imagine that systems like ChatGPT will eventually enable a world in which all of us end up with intelligent digital butlers, basically, who kind of anticipate things that we need, start communicating with both digital systems but also people to request things. So here's one scenario that I can imagine is, a student will set up their butler to request an extension every time, the system anticipates not being able to complete the assignment on time, right? And then you get an email as a faculty member, and it looks like it's written by the student, but it's probably ChatGPT, right? And guess what? You have a system that responds to that, right? and so, like if you take this forward and extrapolate, you can imagine whole conversations happening between people that are actually machines talking to machines. I mean, this is going to happen, right? And then just think about all the different combinations of that, and that's of course just faculty to student, but it could be a range of other ways. Those kinds of like societal changes, I think, are are incredibly difficult to predict and understand and anticipate. But I do think with the technology it will happen in the same way that social media has really transformed the way our culture is. And it wasn't, at the beginning it seemed like, well, okay, I can talk to a few other people. What's the big deal? But it's, it's taken over. And I imagine systems like ChatGPT, assuming that we use them more and more, will evolve in that direction.
All right. So moving on, then, next is Robin Queen, who is a professor in linguistics, and Robin, we were hoping that you would introduce yourself and talk a little about how might AI change the way that we think about student writing.
Thanks, Josh. And actually, rather than introduce myself, I will show you how ChatGPT might introduce me. So as it happened, way before this panel was around, I had asked it who I am. And if you look at the text on your left, that's pretty good. Reads pretty well. But if you look on the right, so this is what a lot of AI researchers call hallucinations. And when you read in the popular press, they talk about, yeah, there are some inaccuracies. In this particular case, there's lots of most of it is inaccurate. It's inaccurate in sort of trivial ways, like it sort of maybe doesn't matter if I got my degree in 1992 or 1996. But taken together, right? So there's no such book that I supposedly wrote at all. So
just get that a little closer
sorry.
to your voice box, please.
Sorry, it's off.
Oh, it's off.
Because I forgot to put it on. The human fallibility. So anyway, I mean, this is one of the things, and I did this in part initially and have done all of the playing I've done with ChatGPT with student writing and student work in general in mind. So how will what will ChatGPT as it is roughly now? So of course it's going to get better and things will change. If we have individualized butlers, we can do a lot more to personalize and specialize what it knows about us. But if you look then, so this one I did 2 days, sorry, if you change to the next slide. So
sorry, it is 2 days later. I transcribed it wrong.
Okay, so this one, right. So this one I did 2 days ago. There's still a lot of hallucinating, but it's better, right? It sort of, it gets a sort of what I work on. It caught the Journal of English Linguistics, which I did actually edit. It still thinks I edited a different journal, which I didn't edit, but mostly it's better. So it's perhaps learned, perhaps in the nature of the interaction I was having with it, something cued different things. This one actually, when I first asked it, said, I need more information about Robin Queen. So then I said, that's why it says the linguist. And so I think, so for me, what this really brings up in the context of student work and student writing is the hallucinations, the inaccuracies, are in many ways trivial, but they add up in ways that are not trivial. And assessing student writing that has been generated by this requires a degree of double checking that is really astronomical, that really makes the task so much harder. How will a student know if the information is accurate or not? How does an instructor know? How does a GSI know? And for me, the biggest, I guess, question, the most interesting question, is what does this mean for large classes which rely on GSI labor? Like any class that relies on any kind of writing beyond a one-page thing. A one-page thing is going to be its own challenge. But how does anyone, how do we figure out now ways to know what kinds of things it's going to hallucinate about? Because right now, if you ask it to generate a bibliography about just about anything, I've tried many bibliographies, maybe 3% is correct. It mostly makes nothing, it just completely makes things up. I've heard from a librarian who said faculty have come and said, can you find this paper for me? It looks really perfect, because it does generate perfect bibliographies. I had to generate one, I was like, oh my God, if even one of these is available, it'd be great. Not a single one was. So, and it was a bibliography of 10. I asked it to generate my own, a bibliography of my work. Not a single thing it came up with was anything I've written. And only one was actually a paper that existed anywhere. So these are the kinds of things I think for thinking about student work. Of course they're going to turn to this. Of course we're going to have, we're all going to set up ways to make our interactions with one another more efficient in the ways that they're not inefficient. But for actually thinking about teaching writing and teaching the assessing of writing or any kind of work, I mean, I think there's really big, high-level conversations about, in the world of this, are 500-person lectures even feasible anymore? And so that, to me, is actually the more interesting question than whether students will use this to cheat or not. I sort of agree with Kentaro. They already cheat if they're going to cheat. They will keep cheating if it'll be easier, whatever. I mean, if you read enough of these, there is a very clear genre to what this thing puts out. So if you read enough of them, you can tell. It's super general, but seems specific, but is never specific. It can't cite anything. So that'll get better, and we'll see how much better. But I do think it asks really big questions of, what does it mean to ask students to do things and to assess the things they do.
All right, next up is Tim McKay, who is a professor in physics and also in the dean's office at LS&A. Tim, how do you think, in addition to introducing yourself, how do you think we should think about developing critical thinking skills in students when AI are available?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and this is a perfect setup for me. What these generative tools do, of course, is generate things for you. They create new sources that didn't exist before you interacted with the system. In a way, those sources are not fundamentally different from all the other sources that we've always had. And so when we think about what's happening when a student is engaging in critical thinking, what we're asking them to do is engage in the act of deciding what they know, in an epistemological act of figuring out what they believe or what they're going to hold as true. The way they do that when they interact with ChatGPT or anything from an AI tool is not fundamentally different from what they do when they turn on the television or speak on a panel and listen to Rada describe these things. I have to have a system for critically deciding how much of what you just said I believe is true, right? And that system includes many features, including that I have known you for decades. You have a reputation. You're embedded in a social system of knowledge that is crucial for validating what it is you say. ChatGPT, I think people will learn very quickly, lacks most of these features, certainly at the detail level. And I think that was splashed on the front page of every newspaper very quickly because it's so easy to recognize. So when I think about what we do when we train students to think critically, I think this new source in some ways can only be an advantage. It's another example of a source of information that has virtues and drawbacks. And we're going to have to think very critically and train students to do the thing that can only be done in your own brain of correlating what you see that's delivered to you with everything else that you've known before, including about things that seem irrelevant, like where did it come from? What is it embedded in? How was it generated? All of those things. In the end, what we're doing when we do critical thinking is to take input from the world, weigh it with a variety of priors that we have developed about how to trust different sources of information. Every source, including your own memory, what you think you already know, that's one, got a set of priors around it. Your senses, what you're seeing in front of you, have a set of priors around it. But every other form of information you get, I have conversations with Rada, I trust Rada. I hear, I take that in one way. I have conversations with someone else, and maybe I'm like, I don't really trust this person. That's true even for authorities, too. I think about the way I know some experts in my field who, if they say something is true, you can take it to the bank because they're a really careful, conservative kind of scholar. And then there's other people who have wonderful ideas, but some of them are really wrong for a while. And you can learn that, right? So I think there's something analogous that will need to go on here. This adaptation of your priors about how you interpret what comes to you, that's critical thinking. And that's the thing that we're training students to do. There's no way that AI can step in and replace that. It can only happen in your own brain. And so I'm not too worried about the threat of this, but it is an interesting new variant.
All right, and introducing our final panelist then, Eric Swanson, who's also in philosophy, which is going to help us out here. So how can we, help students to use their knowledge when they're interacting with this stuff and think about the role they can play there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a treat to go last, I have to say, because I can try to pivot off of some things that other people said. So Rada brought up the issue of reinforcement due to human feedback over the top of the model. And one thing that's important to know about that in contemporary models is that the reinforcement doesn't change the underlying model. It just kind of prioritizes certain kinds of answers that come from the model as opposed to others. So you'll see phenomena where the model won't act very racist or sexist until you give it the right kind of cue, and then you can get around the reinforcement layer over the top. It's very important, I think, for people, not just students, but people in general, to have the kind of understanding of what's going on in the kind of reasoning that a model might be doing or the kind of statistical modeling that a model might be doing so that they can critically respond to a model that might look like it's not racist or sexist, or might look like the hallucinations that Robin was talking about are relatively benign. And to get that understanding, traditionally, to get expert knowledge in a domain, traditionally we've had to do a lot of drudge work. We've had to do a lot of kind of, work in the library, reading the canonical sources and trying to battle with them and trying to take perspectives and figure out which questions to ask, what skills to bring to bear on a question, knowledge how in addition to just knowledge that. But AI promises to eliminate a lot of that drudgery. So I really worry that we need to find new paths to understanding so that we're able to evaluate what's going on in a large language model in a way that's appropriately critical, even though it will reduce, and I think already has reduced a lot of drudge work for a lot of us. So how should students use their knowledge? I think we need to empower students to think of themselves as not just knowers that, but also aspiring knowers how. And what I mean by that is that knowledge how involves skills, like knowing which question to ask, which experiment to run, which experts, as Tim was saying, to trust, and which experts to take as offering interesting hypotheses. That kind of skill does take a lot of work, but we need to reimagine what that work is going to look like in an age of large language models.
So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes here. Does anybody want to respond to something that anybody else has said?
Well, I can just say briefly, one thing that I don't think these systems will go away. So we'll have to figure out how to embrace them and best leverage them as opposed to, well, we don't like them, so I think that's there. And so I'm with that mindset, even if there are things that I don't like about them. So for instance, what Eric was saying, I realized that underlying these models may still be sexist and racist. At some point, I think human nature is like that. Like, people are selfish. If you look at a toddler, they are very selfish. It's something that we are trained into being more generous, which is not to cover up for language models. But I'm thinking more and more that at some point, I think we need to put also boundaries on what can be done with these systems, as opposed to always expecting that poking at them endlessly, they will still resist and still be generous and all that. So I think that will never happen. So putting boundaries and filters on top of what people can do might not be that outrageous at the end of the day. And then the other thing, for what Kentaro said, I think there is this analogy with what we already have, like Course Hero. To me, the difference is that these are hidden things, right? So I could have maybe ChatGPT whispering in my ear what to say now. How do you know? So at some point, it also comes to people's decisions, like students, right? So it could go under the honor code, right? So now I'm supposed to leave the room when I give an exam, and I trust my students, they will not talk to one another. I think they actually don't talk. I mean, I really trust them. We could put, whenever we want them to be like their brain really thinking as opposed to ChatGPT, put that under honor code and just go with that. Because otherwise we cannot really, I mean, it will be like a moving target. Robin's example, like you fix here and then it breaks there, and then you fix it there and it breaks here. I think will be endless.
I actually think that that probably pivots really nicely to the next question that I wanted to ask as we move into this sort of more discussion section, which is, when is it that we think of AI use as cheating versus, say, when is it acceptable? When is it a tool? What different roles should we think of it as having and when?
I mean, in a sense, it just produces for you a new source.
Right.
And so it's just treated like any other source. If you claim a source that you did not create, was created by you, that's a thing we have a strong moral claim against. Already, we need nothing new in that kind of regard. So I think it changes the temptation space in a way, maybe the ease space a little bit. I know that you can feed it a complex essay prompt, the kind that we might have used in the past to discourage students from cheating because it was very particular and unique to our circumstances. You can feed that to a tool like this, and it will give you an answer that shares many features with many student answers. It's very good, for example, at following instructions. So if you say, please be sure to address A, B, C, and Q, there will be 2 sentences about A and 3 about B, and so on. But then it hallucinates halfway through as well. Right? Anyway, it's another source. And if they misuse a source, we already have a system for handling that.
I also think it's not cheating, actually. It doesn't strike me at all as cheating because of the ways that it is so general at the moment. Now, as it gets more able to be more specific and in certain fields, for instance, if you ask it to generate a bibliography about itself, it actually generates a real bibliography. So, I mean, there are domains that it's better at and domains that it isn't. And it reminds me of when Wikipedia appeared, and there was a similar kind of hand-wringing about, oh my God, students are going to be cheating using Wikipedia. I mean, this is similar at the moment. Again, we don't know what's going to happen with it, but it doesn't strike me actually as cheating. I agree, it's a source, you can cite it. The person assessing the writing will know that.
I mean, but let me ask you this. I mean, let's say somebody submits something that is written wholly by ChatGPT and signs their name to it and submits it as if it's their own original work. I mean, wouldn't you consider that cheating?
Probably not, actually. I would consider it evidence of not critically engaging with the actual question. I mean, it wouldn't be I wouldn't think of it as cheating any more than I might think of it as plagiarism. Which,
but
I mean, maybe
isn't plagiarism, yeah.
Sort of,
okay.
yes, sure.
I mean, I would say, I think that, I think plagiarism, at least to me, is a category of cheating, at least when you're trying to get a certain kind of grade in a course.
Yes, so, right.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
I was thinking of it more as like cheating to come up with an answer.
Right, so the ideation and so on, yeah. I think to this question, one of the issues is, again, this potential blurring of how much you use a system like this. So again, I can imagine, a world not too far away. In fact, ChatGPT is already very close to this, where, a student who honestly writes the first draft of something, right? Mm-hmm. But then keeps asking ChatGPT to help improve it over and over and over and over again, and and does it enough times where they're not really necessarily thinking. Like, how, again, I have this example with some of my students that I advise where, you give them point-by-point things that they should improve, and then they start relying on you as the person who does the hard thinking, right? And that's really not transmitting the critical thinking part, right? And I can imagine a system that gets used like this where, the end product looks like somebody who thought very hard to improve their thing, even as they were being honest about it, but in reality, they didn't do a lot of the, cognitive work that was required. And I don't know if that's something where I'm not sure it's really cheating, but it certainly is cheating the student of the opportunity to
And one thing, if you do that with it, so I've done that with it, kept asking it, I took a text, what it ends up doing is stripping the individual voice of the author. And so that becomes a way to recognize it. So I took a text from someone who is very prominent in a certain field, who also writes with code switching. And I put that into the thing and said, first I asked it to proofread it. And it changed everything to make it standardized English, and in one instance, completely changed the meaning of a sentence by doing that. Then I asked it, can you just assess it? Don't change anything. And it essentially said, there's code switching in here, and that may distract readers, because it's too informal or they might not know it. So it reinforces a certain ideological perspective about language, which of course is in the training data because that's true, but it also strips the individual voice from the text.
You know, one thing that I think is interesting, I'm curious to hear what Rada thinks, but you know, I think these systems are just going to get better and better and better and better. Like what we're seeing now, you know, there's a little bit of a parlor game out in the media where people try to find the different ways you can screw up ChatGPT. But I would guess that within a year, most of those things will be gone. And then another couple of years, and some of these things will be gone. And you know, there's no fundamental reason why eventually we won't have a ChatGPT that is, frankly, as good as a college-educated human being.
If it can get into paywalls, publisher paywalls, things will change a lot.
And so, you know, to me, one of the interesting questions is, let's assume we're in that world, which I suspect is 5 to 10 years away.
Sooner.
Right, sooner, right? So Rada says sooner, yeah. And in that world, you know, it won't actually be possible to detect fundamental differences between student writing and you know, AI-generated writing, or frankly, anybody's writing. And so I think that kind of raises the bar for a lot of these questions that we're asking. Right now, yeah, you can fool it or you can detect it. You know, I had a colleague who said, oh yeah, I already had 2 students submit ChatGPT writing, and I asked him, how did you know? He's like, oh, their writing is normally not that good. So.
Well, but so things will be changing, and I already know of efforts to have like other ChatGPT-like, and they're already out there, and there will be more. And my perspective, it's obviously easier said than done. If we could think of ways in which we could leverage, like one direction, I'm teaching this class of 250 people. We keep talking about personalized learning. I mean, what kind of personalization do I do with these people? I don't even know who they are, and I feel bad about it, but it's just like, I'm one, they are 250. So I think there is really an opportunity to go there with these kind of tools, which I would keep it just parenthetically for this panel, like pitching to the university to invest more in this. I mean, we as academics, we cannot do ChatGPT because we don't have the resources. So we have it here, and we can do all the cool things that I know Tim was doing, like can we scale them up and truly do personalized learning? While when we worry about cheating, I mean, that's been a worry we always had, and put guardrails like honor code and other things. Ultimately, if a student really wants to spend 4 years copying ChatGPT into whatever they have to turn in, kind of so be it. How can we enforce that not to happen if that's what they think they will get out of an education? So I would say, rather than spending efforts in terms of cutting people who cheat, more spend efforts in terms of thinking how can we make the most out of these technologies and sort of to our advantage. Like personalized learning is one thing that really speaks to me, but there may be many others.
One thing that the large language models will continue to do badly at, I think, for quite some time is really individualized interaction. I have this particular thing or person or entity that I'm ignorant of in certain respects, and I don't have a lot of data about, and I need to make a particular decision that's geared to that entity or person. In those kinds of scenarios, I could imagine large language models being used in a very different way from the source model, where there is an interaction between the user and the model that involves questions and hypotheticals and that sort of thing. So I think that that might be one way that we should be thinking about preparing students for the world after school. Anything that can be kind of put into just a source framework, any job like that is probably going to be replaced. So we're trying to help them figure out ways to interact with the AI that will be a form of work that humans will still be called upon to do.
Here's a wild speculation. So it is true that one of the things that's fascinating about these tools is that they, as you said, they look back through a set of language, and so they can have a conversation in a way that maintains a bit of coherence, right? And that is something we'd like to do with 250 people, to have an individual conversation with them. So perhaps there are ways to use tools like this to do things like oral exams, where they could wander through a topic and ask sensible next questions of students in response to what they have to say. So the chattiness of these tools is something that it clearly is different from the source model, right?
Yeah.
You don't get to do that with a book or with a web page, but there's an interaction here. I mention it partly because I know that a lot of universities are using much simpler chat bots to do substantive things in service of students. They're often about very ordinary, repetitive things like, how do I get an override to get into Math 105? And it used to be they had to get an appointment with an advisor, and now they can connect to a tool that's able to speak to them and get that taken care of at 3 a.m. when they're interested in doing it, right? So there may be some real interesting applications of these that go beyond the superficial.
I think also one of the interesting things going off what the two of you were just saying is, so you can very much interact with this particular tool, and I'm sure that will continue to improve. And in those interactions, you have two parties who are producing output, and you have two parties who are interpreting output, but you only have one party that has intention. And because that party assumes intentionality of everyone it interacts with, right? Humans assume that in fact, it's an ideology we have that language is driven by intention rather than, say, interpretation, that what the speaker means is what is the true meaning. The AI is never going to be intentional. It's going to look intentional, it's going to seem intentional, you're going to think it's intentional, but it's not, and it's quick to tell you that it's not. But so in that interactive development, I mean, that is kind of a conceptual question to me that is really interesting to think about, and think about what do you do as it becomes a better interactant, but still lacks intention of any kind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna modify what was gonna be the next question in the sense that I think a really interesting question here would be sort of, what do we want students to know about what these tools are good and bad at, right? And how do we want to think about that, right? Especially in light of, for those of you who encountered it, the sort of Sydney interaction with the new Bing chat that went down a very dark road very quickly, right? If you don't know about it, the new Bing chat apparently declares itself Sydney when it's answering questions in particular ways, and decided to probe whether somebody's marriage was based on true love or not in a very awkward set of circumstances.
We sometimes have instructors do things like that.
One thing I try to impress on my students, I teach a philosophy and AI class pretty much every semester these days. One thing I try to impress on them is that the language models are trained on the past. They can raise possibilities about the future, but we should be careful not to let them decide things about the future, partly because we don't really know what values people are going to have in 5 or 10 years. And it's not clear that the values that are embedded 5 or 10 years ago, even though exactly as Rada was suggesting, they were human values, they might not be the ones that we want to carry forward into the future. And it's sometimes through listening to other people that our values come to change, through thinking about what we can live with and what we can't live with together.
Well, and I think since you mentioned values, for instance, being aware that the values encoded in whatever models are there are not representative of every single culture, right? So I might not find myself represented there, and I might get either frustrated or like, why is that this is a normal thing according to this model, which is maybe not my normal thing. So having awareness of that. And in broader terms, that seemed to be, I mean, it was a thing in AI. People were always talking in the context of spoken dialogue systems, maybe 5, 10 years ago, how it is important to always keep features that will make it very clear that this is an AI system, it's not a human. So when you interact with them, you don't have the expectation that you have from a human. Now, in what we see in ChatGPT, I mean, it has a name that suggests an agent, but at some point you may lose that awareness just because it's so human-looking. So somehow building that awareness, whether it will be regulated, which I keep calling for, I think we need more regulations and having more transparency into what this system can and cannot do. And otherwise, for the users to be aware, this is really a system. It can be emotionally manipulative, but it's a system. It's not, and sort of you have to use it like that. And to me, that would be very, very important. Hopefully, someday soon, it will be done by the systems where we'll have that disclaimer. Like on ChatGPT, there should be always on screen that say, I'm an artificial machine or whatever. So you don't get lost on like this thing falling in love with you and then, I don't know, telling you something about your marriage.
I think there's a really interesting question that I don't think we know the answer to yet, which touches on what Robin was saying about intention, right? Which is that human beings are so hardwired to anthropomorphize and see agency in other things. And I think there's a question that we don't quite know because we haven't really had AI of this level of sophistication before, which is, will we really be able to to really see something that seems intelligent and intentional as something that actually isn't? And will that, whether if we were able to do it, it might mean one thing, and if we're not able to ultimately do it as a society, it might mean another thing. Even with the disclaimers. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the New York Times article that you were mentioning was, that the reporter, despite understanding the underlying situation, that it is a computer and so on, still interpreted all as creepy and so on, right? I mean, and it's really hard if you read the transcript not to read it that way. But if you flip your mind, like the way I think of these things is, they're basically spitting out something that looks a lot like something else it read, right? And so really it was, it probably had in its data some series of text messages of couples breaking apart and so on, right? And it was basically just rehashing that kind of data. But it's very difficult not to read it as, oh my gosh, this thing is trying to get me to split from my partner. And I think that's one of the larger questions that we won't know until we start using these systems at large scale.
So I have a question maybe for Rada, sort of. These things are producing text, of course. They can do it really fast. They can do a lot of it. Does one anticipate a moment where most of the text that they're processing has been produced by tools like this? And where does it wander once that starts to happen?
Well, I already had that thought because one thing that Robin brought up is this lack of actuality, right? So here and there is just something put out there confidently and it's untrue. And I've been working on misinformation from humans, and I think it's very interesting to work on misinformation from machines. And I was talking with my students how we need to rush to collect data because soon what's out there will not be guaranteed to be human produced.
Yeah.
Just because there is so much of this, I might get an author next to it, but maybe it's really just ChatGPT or other tools, maybe with some polishing on top. So there will be, and that, we'll refer to it as overfitting, which is something that I do think that it could be worrisome, and it's not only overfitting of the system itself, it's also at some point overfitting of the humans who use it, who will start thinking in that style and will just be limited by whatever these systems can produce. And that will be sort of a societal overfitting, which unless, again, we think of actively of how to not let that happen, that could be an issue.
Right, so the more it tells people, I got my degree in 1992, the more true that becomes over time.
Well, even,
and it doesn't really matter, but.
Right, the generic way, like staying at generic levels, which is the current style, and that obviously will change. Like 1 year from now will be different, but it's still like an AI-generated text, and if a lot of people use it, and that becomes what you learn from, and what you are graded on, and then we'll just, we are very good at overfitting for whatever we get rewards. If we get an A based on that kind of text, then next time, guess what I'm going to do? So it's
right.
Yeah, and I will bracket here that I think things like how recursivity ends up working in this is a really fascinating thing, but I want to pull us back a little bit to thinking about the classroom in sort of at least the next couple of years, probably before that explodes. And so I do want to, I want us to transition a little bit to thinking about policy here and how we think about policy, right? And so there are different policies that are going to exist to deal with this, right? There's instructor policies, there's unit policies, there's university policies. We're talking about government regulation too. How do we think about those, especially given that our students are likely to be coming into you know, coming into college with very different experiences from this. We know already that like New York State has, or New York City has said, you can't use this in the public schools at all, where some schools may embrace it more. There are gonna be big differences in our students' experiences coming in.
Yeah, so I do think that we, especially as academics, need to be very quick to establish norms around what would be considered cheating or not, what's effectively plagiarism or not. I think along those lines, we want to establish like new methods of citation, right? That, you know, we basically teach all our students how to cite sources that are written by other human beings. I think we want to have, you know, standards for what we do when a student uses a machine in some form to, you know, support what they're doing for assignments. And I think we want to do that as quickly as possible, because otherwise what will happen is there'll be a crazy world of all kinds of standards and we won't end up with a standard. So I do think that's important. The provost's office here is actually just about to form a task force to kind of figure out some of these things, and hopefully we'll have, you know, at least some kind of standard at University of Michigan. And then I think at the societal level, there does need to be a lot of regulation, you know, of ChatGPT, and not just in the context of how students and faculty use it, but at society overall. You know, I think there's so many things you could talk about that, but like just as an example of what could be a kind of regulation that I think would be interesting is, you know, these systems, at least for now, are not systems that, you know, somebody with their own personal computer can run just because of the sheer amount of compute power that's required. You know, would it be unreasonable to ask anybody who's making these systems available to like keep a record of, you know, let's say the last 3 months of things that have been asked of it and, you know, what has transpired? Or maybe some categories of conversations should be kept for longer periods of time. You know, I mean, sometimes that might be to catch instances of plagiarism. I can imagine whole businesses starting around, oh, okay, you're a university, we'll sell you a license to, you know, your ability to inspect ChatGPT to see if, you know, it's basically plagiarism detection. But I mean, I think even for society as a whole, there's some value in being able to trace what kinds of conversations people have had, you know, certainly under, you know, very careful, you know, privacy type situations. But like, I'm sure there'll be some case soon where the police will want to know, what did this person have a conversation with, what machine, and what caused them to lead to that. So I think there's a range of regulation that we could imagine that would help address some of the challenges that these kinds of systems produce.
I think I'm not sure exactly what kind of policy implication this has, but I've played with it a little bit, trying to take different political stances. And it really lands in a kind of a centrist position. And it's very clear, I'm a bot, I don't have political opinions. But it's easy for me to see how people at extreme edges in the political spectrum would see it as extremely biased. So if you ask it questions about the 2020 election, if you are someone who believes whatever set of facts you have gathered to lead you to believe that the election was stolen, you will see ChatGPT as biased. And so that's, to me, also a kind of interesting question. Again, I don't know what the policy implications exactly are. I was thinking about a student. If a student has a particular perspective about something that is not supported by, I'll call it the empirical evidence, but still holds that position very strongly and wants to produce it in a written text, they're going to not have a fun time. And they're going to buy, who knows what they'll do. I mean, they won't use it. And I mean, there's just a lot of things that I think are really interesting to think about and wonder about the policy implications for those kinds of scenarios.
And there's a huge range of ways, and people are talking about using these in productive ways in the classroom. I'm sure that many of those will evolve.
Yes.
I would encourage people to explore them immediately. I think there's lots of cool things to be done. You know, from asking ChatGPT to respond to an essay, producing that essay, and then asking the student to write it in a really different way.
Right.
You know, just to do, there's so many ways that one might use it to foster creative thinking and critical thinking. You know, look at this, decide what it's not. It's a tool that certainly will play a big role in that. And I think as that happens, it will be easier to see how we want to use it in the classroom.
Right.
And the plagiarism version should be easy to shunt to the side, I think.
Right, and I think it has great implications and is a very probably powerful tool for students who are not first language users of English. That it has there's a lot of opportunity there. It reaches a point where it's no longer, but I mean, for sure, if you're worried, as I was as a student in Germany, that my essay was completely gibberish because I wasn't using the language right. I mean, I think there's potential there that is important to explore.
I think I'd just add that in addition to the policy and regulatory spheres, there's kind of an ethical sphere that we need to think about in a creative and imaginative way. When a really transformative, oh sorry, I think I ran out of batteries.
I'll be down with the handheld in a moment.
Thanks. So in addition to policy and regulation, there's an ethical sphere that we need to think about in an imaginative and creative way, because when a new technology comes on the scene, it's not always clear that the ethical perspectives that we were taking are going to put us in good stead in the future. And that means that there needs to be a certain kind of experimentation to figure out what we can live with and what inadvertently kind of contradicts values that we have. But even though I think that experimentation is important, it's also important not to see that it just doesn't really matter, right? That it could just, be that the ethics came out one way or another and it would, not be right or wrong. But that we need to figure out what the right and wrong is together. I think that sometimes when we move to the policy and regulatory question too quickly, not to suggest that we're doing that today, but when we move to it too quickly, we're suggesting to students that we don't want them to engage in the ethical hard work of figuring out what they want their lives to look like in a world of these kinds of models and the work and other spheres that will be influenced by them, how they want those to look as well.
All right, so I've got one last prescribed question before we're going to turn it over to the audience, which is, where do we think we're going from here, right? So where do we think, I think we've already touched on this in a couple ways, but where do we think these tools are going in the future, and how do we think faculty should be prepared for them? And I will tell you, as on sort of an amusing side note for this, that we asked all the questions to this panel also to ChatGPT. They were mostly rather long-winded until we beat it over the head to say, act like a panelist, not like an essay writer. But it did say, among other things, that we should all engage in ongoing professional development as faculty. So
You could put that sentence just about anywhere, couldn't you?
So thoughts, where do we think we're going from here, and how should faculty be prepared for?
It's going to be a wild ride.
I remember some of these wild rides. I mean, when I wrote my PhD thesis, there was no way to cite a web page because there were no web pages, right? So, we've been through some of this before. I know that when Google search first appeared, there was a lot of concern that no one would ever learn a fact again. And, we've adapted to that in an interesting kind of way. So I think we're headed toward a similar period of time. I do think we can see it coming better maybe than we might have in some of those earlier steps, because this is now a part of a process. So I can imagine people exploring this much faster. Our students certainly are. I'll mention that we had a conversation about this in our curriculum committee. We have a number of student members, and they jumped right up with many comments about what instructors ought to be doing to ask students to do things that won't encourage them to use ChatGPT. And that's because they've been out exploring it like crazy, trying everything that we're asking them to do with it, just to see what it does.
Well, I was thinking also something that Robin said earlier, or Kentaro, that it's really like, at some point, this is not a search tool. I mean, I see those analogies out there. I don't agree that this is the next search engine. But in terms of a transformatory change, when search engines became a commodity, that's what's happening now, right? Yeah. So it used to be you had to go to the library, find your book, read the book and find the citation. Now you just search and there you have it. So establishing some ways in which, for instance, you have to give a reference. So this came from ChatGPT. I'm pretty sure very soon there will be other such systems, or it came from whatever other system, and give a reference to the source, similar to how you do it in other ways. Like I said, I mentioned before honor code, so if we don't think it's okay for people to copy something from, say, Wikipedia on their exam, then similarly it shouldn't be copied from ChatGPT, and that will be under the honor code. Wikipedia, we can check it because it's out there. ChatGPT maybe a little less so, other than style, so that will be the other thing. But I would say in terms of future, one thing that it will be, I think it's important in how it will evolve. It's more than technology itself. You hinted at the gap between those who have a lot and those who have less. So for instance, if it becomes so embedded in what we do, and maybe if it means a $20 subscription per month, which seems to be the current model for a student to have access to it, what would that mean? Is it like whoever can afford it has it, who doesn't, doesn't? That's one thing. There are other things, for instance, if we think of personalized learning, what would that mean? Like taking all the data sources that we have for University of Michigan and putting them in OpenAI and hoping that something will come out which is personalized, maybe not. So also thinking of currently just a handful of companies who really owns it. Is that what we want to really build on top and say we build this very nice personalized education, and one day, I don't know, OpenAI, Microsoft says, well, no more because whatever. And so it's all cut out. So thinking more of these other aspects, which is not purely like cheating, not cheating, it's not even quality of content, it's more like what are we building on? Do we want to build on top of this handful of commercial enterprises, or do we want to have our own version? So, and is that equity like for everyone? Can everyone afford it or not? Those would be, I don't know that we have answers right now, but those would be like part of that future, I believe.
Which is also about the nature of labor around this kind of profession. Like what the nature of labor will change, for sure. And what I was saying at the beginning, like what it means to have people assessing writing, and what do they need to know to be able to, and how much longer is it going to take? I mean, to me, playing with this, I think a student could write their own paper so much faster than using GPT and also checking all the information as accurate. So I think that whole, the kind of the nature of what labor is, and those inequities that may be inbuilt. Who is the one who has to do the checking? Just, and who doesn't have to? I think those are kind of, again, I don't know what the future will actually look like, but I'm pretty sure it will change the nature of, kind of what our profession, what academia generates as its, whatever its professional outcomes.
And we've been through that many times. I mean, many are way prior to our times, right? There were times when there was no paper, right? Because it wasn't even. So
yes, exactly.
who would have paper to even write on it? And then the typewriter, the computer, the
And
internet,
just trying to anticipate what that labor shift might look like, which helps people get ready for it.
So speaking of labor shifts, I mean, I think one of the bigger challenges will be the degree to which those of us who think our jobs are secure will increasingly find them not so secure with AI. I don't anticipate that, like, for example, at least for a while, probably, hopefully until I retire, there won't be a technology that can do my job end to end. But like, for example, some of the things you were talking about, like customized feedback for students. I mean, if a computer can do that really well, it begs the question, well, why do you need one faculty member per 250 students? It might just become one for 10,000. And then some of us will not be with a job because the university say, well, it's a lot cheaper if we hire the best faculty, decrease their number by 90%, and then have computers do the rest. I actually do think that the current generation of AI is going to begin to have impacts that are not just the kind of things we've seen before. Like, yes, we've seen tremendous changes before, and maybe we've adapted to some of them, but human civilization has never seen another thing that rivals it in intelligence and can mimic its abilities, right, to this degree. I mean, I'm curious what Rada thinks, but I feel like we are on the cusp of what some people call the singularity, which is that moment when computer AI system becomes as smart as a well-educated human being. And after that point, the technology is just going to get smarter and smarter and smarter while we're stuck with our genetics. So although that area also might see some change. But yeah, I think that's going to be radical. And on the one hand, it's super exciting and interesting. Like, I feel like this is a really interesting time to be alive. But it's also a little bit frightening because I think we won't necessarily be able to keep up with all the things that means for us.
Well, on that very happy note, let's hand it over to the audience. What are you all wondering about?
I will walk the mics over to whoever has a question.
Yeah, please wait until the mic gets to you for the question so that it is preserved in posterity in the recording.
For the future AIs that can
Yeah,
borrow
so
the
we'll learn from all of us, for better or worse.
So thank you all for the great discussion. I'm not sure how well positioned any of you are to answer this, but I'm most curious about the mood among current students, especially to what extent there's any kind of existential crisis around systems like this potentially devaluing the kinds of things they aspire to produce, whether that's critical essays or code or scientific experiments or whatever that might be.
Well, that's a lot of questions, actually, right? Because there's a lot of students, and they're all situated very differently in relation to this. So I certainly am aware of some students who are deeply engaged in thinking about this, what it means for their future and so on. And I would say many people in the world of coding are thinking hard about this. I mean, this feels like an application where there could be really big labor changes in the not very distant future. So I think they're pondering that right now. On the creative side, I don't know of students who are panicked about it yet. I mean, one reads about this in the Atlantic, for example. I have to say, the first application that came to mind that I think they're out of business is op-ed writers. I mean, people who are just going to give you some quick opinion about something overnight. Why would you just not have this do it? So I'm not hearing that so much from students yet. I would say that students are experiencing a lot of existential crisis right now about a whole long list of things, almost all of which is related to technology one way and another, whether it's climate change or AI. They are, as you said, living in a really interesting time, and they're not saying, well, maybe I'll get to retirement before this happens. So it is clearly worse. This is a reason, of course, to be bringing it to the center of the classroom, even if this is not what you're talking about. If you're doing anything with writing, why not be talking about this? Because everything about what writing is and what it means and why we value it, to not be talking about this would be a mistake at this point. So.
Well, I would say it's also at different levels. So it's, of course, all the undergraduates, but say the niche of people working in NLP and doing research, like my own PhD students. I think there are lots of questions that they would have as to what is relevant in what they do. And we are talking about people losing jobs. And it's really just a coincidence. But having seen how, on one hand, these companies are investing billions in technologies, and on their other hand, they're just laying off thousands of researchers, I was thinking, well, I don't know about truck drivers losing their job. How about researchers losing their job? So it was really just a coincidence at this point in time. But I think it's really, again, the mindset would be how can we leverage what we have and do better with this, as opposed to a lot of my work has been invalidated by now. Who cares about what I've done 10 years ago? Nobody really, because it's not necessarily, it's been covered by what's now. It's just because the progress is so quickly. To me, and I'm going back to what I said previously, it's really about ownership of these models, which is, to me, the most, as optimistic, and I really see an amazing future in this. It's the part that I see really weak right now is the fact that it's owned by a couple of companies. It can be only built by a couple of companies because they have the resources. If I want, and I have some ideas on how to change them to do, say, personalized learning, I can only do things at the surface, and maybe that bottom will change, and it does change tomorrow. So what I've done at the surface is gone, that fine-tuning and prompt engineering. So that, I think that to me is the more troublesome, which I could see students also having a problem with, that you build things and then tomorrow that what you build on is gone because you don't own it. And so it does require thinking of how even in such a niche as researchers in NLP, like how is that affecting your work?
I think the pace of development really contributes to that too. If you have a student who's kind of risk averse about their future welfare, they could get scooped on something any given week. It's hard to reassure someone that a research program that directly interacts with NLP is going to be fruitful in the long term.
Well, on a more positive note, my thinking, and it's very high level, like when I first saw this, I think this is the first time that I was impressed. I mean, I've seen a lot of things before, but this is the first time like, wow, I mean, this is quite something. And my first reaction, which was maybe overly optimistic, like, well, now people will have time to spend more time on societal impact. Right? So rather than
maybe we'll
doing
get the
things and
20-hour work
engineering. Like, so that, I mean, to me, it's a great opportunity. And we have all these, like, tons of problems. You mentioned climate change, and it's just one. And there is poverty, and there is, like, education. There are so many kids that just don't, I mean, we are really, I mean, so spoiled here, to be honest. I mean, there are so many places that don't have anything. So that's, like, it's really an opportunity to do things better. So all these students could really make a difference. Again, is the question, will that happen? Like, would there be this shift where now that we don't have to worry about these technologies, they are there, we can just use them. Can we leverage them and say, do education in whatever country we pick, like Nigeria or Kenya, or what we think would really need? So that, I mean, it is a tremendous need, like whether we can go there, it's a second question.
I think also for students, it opens up a really fruitful path for people who really don't want to be good writers and don't care about writing particularly, but may care about video games, or just kind of the idea of how you demonstrate that you are a person with a particular education level. There is a lot of possibility that can start to shift a little bit. Like, not everybody needs to be able to write a 5-page essay on whatever. Most, probably the majority of people outside of academia don't ever write much more than a page or two, maybe, with some formulaic appendices. And so to me, I have heard some students talk about it this way of sort of, finally I can let ChatGPT do these things to let me do these. Like, I have no interest in video games personally, but it makes me kind of illiterate then too, right? And so, I think there are, like, for students, that is a real possible path to start thinking about. And for all of us in higher ed, especially in the humanities and the social sciences, where we put a lot of effort and attention to writing in a particular way, maybe we could put attention into other kinds of things, and that writing actually does get taken care of. So again, that may be too utopian, but I have heard students talk a little bit, and the first Atlantic article that came out about this basically said the same thing. Like, maybe it's fine if not every student wants to be able to write I think this was an English art teacher, write an essay on Beowulf or whatever. Like, maybe that's fine. And so to me, I think students are also thinking in those ways to some degree.
First of all, thank you for the very informative discussion. Okay, so citing ChatGPT as a source is something that academic researchers are currently doing, and some have taken it to the next level by listing it as a co-author. What are your thoughts on listing ChatGPT as a co-author?
Well, I would say it's almost like listing Google as a co-author or other things that we use. I mean, we are using all day long. I don't know. I think indicating that was using the writing, or maybe using quotes if it comes straight from there. Although, I mean, ChatGPT as a particular example, given also what Robin said, it's not citing its own references. So I don't know that I would want to attribute something that clearly has come from Wikipedia. It just happens that ChatGPT put it out there. So, I mean, that aside, if it comes straight, maybe you would use quotes or something like that. But co-authorship, I think it's more like a move out there to show off or something like that. I mean, why not put Google then as co-author?
So I think that's a movement in the direction of trying to figure out the norms for how we cite and incorporate this kind of technology. I don't necessarily think co-authorship is the right way to go, but there was an interesting case recently, not about ChatGPT, but about somebody who had used Midjourney, which is like DALL-E, to write a comic book. And interestingly, the Copyright Office, I believe, came down, this is a very recent decision, came down and said that this person who wrote the comic book could copyright the story because it was their own, as well as the layout of the comic book because that was also their own, but that they could not copyright the images because they were generated by a system that was sufficiently complex enough that it wasn't genuinely the creation of a human being. And again, I think that's the legal system trying to figure out what these systems are. My guess is it will take a few years before we figure these things out. But hopefully we'll land on a system of norms that we can all agree on as a society as to what the right way is. I think the people who cited as a co-author were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to say, look, we didn't do this entirely ourselves. A machine was involved in some creative aspect of it, and so we're going to include it as a co-author. And whether we end up doing that going forward, I think is something that we all have to kind of be involved in negotiating. But I do think that we want to, Rada was saying earlier, like everything that's written by a computer should come with a disclaimer. This is written by a computer. And similarly, all of us who incorporate writing by machine should cite that fact in some way.
Yeah. Something that Robin mentioned earlier is just a very brief comment that you made earlier in the discussion. That was, what about when it gets around the paywalls of the publishers? And so I'm wondering, that led me to start thinking about how does this then change the willingness to share the information that the models need, right, to train on? Does this change your willingness, if you're a researcher, to share your information? So I wonder just kind of any thoughts you have in that space.
I mean, I'm sure that once it gets behind paywalls, it will absorb these things and be able to, utilize them and give you more real papers because it will have more to work with. I've been wondering also about how, just to give an example, I asked it to write essays about introductory physics concepts. And what it did was remarkably accurate reproduction of common misconceptions that students also have. Because they're all over the literature, they're out there, right? So I was pondering for myself, can we create a layer, a training layer on top or whatever, like the human layer, that corrects that for certain contexts so that it would be much more likely to give students things that are not reproducing those misconceptions. So in the same way that you might ask yourself, should I share this? You might say, do I want to embed this in something that's then going to deliver it to lots of people in some fruitful way?
I'll give you a fun example that happens around some of that, which is that it was recently pointed out to me that if you ask ChatGPT right now, which weighs more, 1 pound of bricks or 2 pounds of feathers, it will say that they're equal. Because what's actually happened to some degree is that some of the trick problems get built in, and then as the trick problems get built in, the way that the algorithm ends up responding is to try to anticipate the trick rather than to actually pay attention to the specifics of the problem. It also massively screws up the Monty Hall problem if you tell it which door the car is already behind. So these kinds of things, like if it anticipates the trick because that's out there, it now recurses itself to its own unique ending. I don't know what to make of that per se, but it's sort of an interesting twist on that.
I think too, in playing with it, so I had a long interaction with it about my own work and kind of continuing to ask it, to generate stuff. And at one point it said something like, well, I need more information to do this about Robin Queen. And I said, well, I am Robin Queen. And it responded by saying, well, if you're Robin Queen, you know the answer. You know your own publications. And then it said, I'm happy to help you with your research and projects if you give me a list of your publications or something. So, I mean, it was an interesting, it made me think a lot about the kind of question of sharing things and what is personal information. I would never consider my publications somehow personal information exactly, but the way the algorithm works, it did. And I loved, it's probably my favorite thing that I've had it say is like, well, if you are Robin Queen, you know your own publications. I think that's pretty, that's pretty smart.
Question over here.
I have a question. Thank you for all being here. I guess as a young man, my question is just like, how do you see AI in the world in like the next 10 to 15 years, like as somebody who's gonna have children soon, like how do you see the next generation, like not the generation in college right now, like the young kids, how do you see them fitting into this?
Well, I think it's now at the point where it goes past the developers or researchers, right? So up to maybe 5 years ago, I haven't really thought about policy making as a group that I would interact with, although I do interact a lot with people in other disciplines. So I think very quickly, and I'm hearing already, I talked to just 2 days ago with people from Gary Peters' office, who's one of the Michigan senators. And it's not that I talk to him, it's more like it's on their mind, policies around AI. So I think that will be happening alongside with all this progress that we see. Like I said at the beginning, I don't think it will go away, but I think there will be more regulations and hopefully more benefits in terms of how AI is being used.
One thing that I think about a lot with kids is this difference between individualized knowledge and the kind of general knowledge that ChatGPT has until it asks Robin, like, tell me more about yourself. But when it's doing that, it's doing it in a very superficial way. It's not going back and changing all the weights. It's doing a kind of in-context learning, which is really impressive and really surprising, I think, to all researchers in the field. But it's not the same kind of learning that it was originally trained on. And I think that trying to prioritize individual connection is something that we really need to encourage our kids to come to. I've been surprised every 3 months by AI for the last 6 years, so I hesitate to say I would be surprised and then put anything after it. But I would be surprised if large language models did very well with individualized knowledge about people. And I think that that's something that you can reassure someone will be valuable into the future. And if I turn out to be wrong, they can come back and complain to me.
There's been one over here.
My name is Kristen Brigard, and I'm with the Ford School of Public Policy in the Science, Technology, and Public Policy group. And just for everyone's awareness, if you don't know, Shobita Parthasarathi, who is an affiliated faculty member at MIDAS, has written a report that is for policymakers. I have some hard copies here. I also have, if you want to give me your card or your email address, I'm happy to send them over. This was published last year, and it's what's in the chatterbox, large language models, why they matter, and what we should do about them. And basically, it's just looking at the implications of systems like these. And this report was written for policymakers. So we kind of talk about the implications and also some policy recommendations. So.
Oh, yes, we are getting short on time. Is there one more question that people want to ask?
Since I'm close here, I'll ask one. Hi, thank you very much. So one of the classes I teach is a technical communication course for computer science majors, and I decided to, basically teaching them how to write the types of reports that they'll have to write as engineers. And I decided to let them use ChatGPT this semester if they want to, provided they cite it as a tool. I have them cite it as if, as they would cite Photoshop or a simulation package or any other tool they would use. I kind of figure at this level, okay, they've learned enough basic composition types of skills that if I want to let them leverage this, that makes sense. But at some point, earlier in their education, they had to learn some basic composition skills that that are involved. And so kind of like how I've yet to meet a second grade teacher who would let her students use a calculator when learning their times tables, but at some point a few years later, they're allowed to use the calculator. So while it's kind of easy for me to feel like, okay, they're over that line, wherever that line is, like, how do we kind of explore where those lines are? And you already kind of spoke to the enforcement issue of wherever we decide that line is, but how much does the enforcement vary based on where that line is? I'll just throw that open to anyone who wants to.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's really about what's the best way to educate somebody, right? And I think your analogy is terrific, right? Which is, at some point, at least at this point, we still believe there is some value in individual students learning their multiplication tables, not because we don't have calculators that can do it, but because something about that skill and the ability to call it on demand is of great value, even in an age in where we have those machines. And I think what you're saying is that with ChatGPT, if we're not careful about how we introduce it into schools, then students will never learn what it means to construct a good sentence and what good grammar is and how to write in a way that is presenting a clear argument and all of that. I mean, I think on that count, what we do in schools generally is the right approach, which is we don't have calculators in second grade, and hopefully we won't have ChatGPT in fourth grade, right? The challenge for all of us, especially in this room, who are faculty, is that once you get to college, it's a lot harder to say you can't use this tool. Maybe you can do that in the classroom, but you can't do it at home, et cetera. I suspect that some of us, maybe not everybody, but some of us will go back to handwritten blue book exams that are proctored, because that will be one of the few ways where we know the student is producing the knowledge completely on their own. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, I do believe there's lots of places where technology can help with education, but one of the biggest things we need to know as faculty is to be able to assess what can the student do themselves. And if we allow the student to always do everything with a machine, we can no longer make that distinction. So I think that's a great question, and it will be something we'll have to kind of figure out as faculty, as a university.
Kentaro's great answer raises another question, which is how do we explain to students why it's important to do that? We need to explain that they're acquiring certain skills through that handwritten exam, as much drudgery as it involves, that can't be replaced by the AI. And I think that sometimes we kind of assume that they know that, and we need to find ways to make that knowledge more tangible to them.
Yeah, if what you're trying to do is to get them to the point where they can produce that piece of technical writing, or let's say another way, that piece of technical writing can be produced, then it doesn't matter whether they have the skill to do that. But if what you're trying to do is to get them to the point where they can generate a coherent argument about something based on their own beliefs, right, then there's no way ChatGPT can do that. And so being clear about what it is you're actually asking them to do, not give you a piece of writing, but actually generate in their own mind a piece of writing.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, panelists, for this wonderful discussion. It was fun. And if you don't know MIDAS already, we are the Data Science Institute at the University of Michigan, and we're trying to help connect different researchers together to help spur lots of interesting new data science and AI work, some of which you may not realize is now going to enter your fields as we go forward. But we'll try to continue this as a series of conversations into the future, because I think it's important to do. And so hopefully we will see many of you again. Thank you very much for coming.